Sauron's 7 rings failed to dominate the Dwarf Lords. Their stubborn nature made them immune to becoming wraiths like men. But immune doesn't mean unaffected. The rings amplified their natural greed, planting seeds of bitterness that would fester for centuries. So what happens when that magical influence is combined with ancient grudges, economic jealousy, and promises of power beyond their wildest dreams? Well, you get an army. Hi guys, my name is Jason. I'm a fantasy author. I love creating my own complex histories. And today we're not just asking who Sauron's dwarves were, but how they fell. We'll explore the many paths to darkness that led to some of Aule's children to serve the Dark Lord instead. When we ask who served Sauron, the map of Middle-earth gives us our first and biggest clue. There were 7 great clans of the Dwarves. The Longbeards of Durin's folk are the most famous, living under the Misty Mountains. In the Blue Mountains to the west, we have the Firebeards and the Broadbeams. But to the east, far from the side of elves and the men of the west, lived 4 other clans: the Iron Fist, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks, and Stonefoots. The east had a long, dark history. Ever since the First Age, it was the domain of Morgoth. The men who lived there often worshipped him as a god, a tradition his most powerful servant Sauron would later inherit and exploit. It's no great leap to assume the dwarves living in these lands were exposed to the same corrupting influence for thousands of years. Tolkien himself confirmed this suspicion. In one of his later notes published in The Peoples of Middle-earth, he wrote, "Alas, it seems probable that, as men did later, the dwarves of the far eastern mansions and some of the nearer ones came under the shadow of Morgoth and turned evil." This wasn't a Second Age development. This was an ancient corruption. Long before Sauron forged the Rings of Power, some of these eastern clans may have already harbored an evil mind. When men first traveled west into Beleriand, they were initially wary of the dwarves they met, telling the elves they had encountered some of evil mind back in the east. So when Sauron began building his empire in Mordor, he didn't need to conquer these dwarves. He just needed to knock on their doors. They were neighbors and for some, old allies under a previous master. They likely became Sauron's primary weapon suppliers, their mountain forges churning out armor and blades for his vast armies of orcs and easterlings. While few might have fought on the front lines, their contributions to his war machine would have been immense. It's one thing to fight an army of orcs, it's another to fight an army of orcs armed and armored by the finest smiths in Middle-earth. Not all of Sauron's dwarven allies came from the far east. Some may have harbored a hatred that was far older and more personal. Before the Longbeards ever carved the first hall of Khazad-dûm, another group of dwarves already lived in the west, the Petty Dwarves, or the Noglith Nibbim. Exiled from the great dwarf cities in the First Age for reasons lost to time, they were a diminished and secretive people. They were the first dwarves the elves of Beleriand encountered, and the relationship was not a good one. The elves, not realizing they were sentient people, hunted them. Later, when the grander dwarf kingdoms of Nogrod and Belegast were made contact, they looked down on their exiled kin. The Petty Dwarves were caught between elves who didn't respect them and other dwarves who rejected them. Their bitterness festered for thousands of years, personified by their most famous member, Mim. Mim's tale is the story of Turin Turambar, and it's one of betrayal born from grief and deep-seated grudges. He lost his home and his sons, and his hatred for both elves and orcs led him to make desperate, ruinous choices. When Beleriand sank beneath the waves at the end of the First Age, most assumed the Petty Dwarves were wiped out. But it's likely some survived, scattered into the wildlands and nursing their grievances in secret. For 3,000 years they remembered. They remembered the elves taking their lands. They remembered the Longbeards claiming dominion over the dwarf kind. Their culture was built on one unifying principle: revenge. For Sauron, these communities were the perfect fifth column. His agents wouldn't have needed to offer rings or gold, they just needed to offer a target. The deal was simple: guide our orc armies through secret mountain passes, sabotage the supply lines of the Last Alliance, and create chaos behind enemy lines. In return, when Sauron wins, the great halls of Khazad-dûm and Erebor will be theirs. The Longbeards will finally know what it feels like to be driven from their homes by their own kin. This wasn't about power, it was about payback. Now, quick thing before we continue, I know you've got a limited budget and even more limited time, so I'm not selling you anything. I just want to invite you to a free fantasy community over on School. When you join, I give you 4 of my books completely free, a few novellas and short stories, no strings, and if you join and decide my writing isn't for you, all you've lost is a minute of your time. If you like it, you can upgrade to a paid tier and help support the channel, but it's simple. The link's down in the description. Now back to betrayals and ancient evils. Sometimes the path to darkness isn't paved with ancient hatreds, but with something far more common: professional jealousy. For thousands of years, the 7 houses of the dwarves existed in a state of rough equality, but the discovery of Mithril beneath Khazad-dûm changed everything. This true silver was lighter than silk and stronger than steel. It wasn't just precious, it was revolutionary. Suddenly, the Longbeards of Durin's folk weren't just first among equals, they were in a league of their own. Their wealth became absolutely legendary, and their friendship with the elven smiths of Eregion, led by Celebrimbor, made them them the undisputed center of the dwarven world. The other houses, particularly those in the east, watched this with growing resentment. Their own crafts, once a source of immense pride, now seemed like trinkets compared to the mithril-blessed works of Khazad-dûm. Sauron's agents were masterful at exploiting this. They didn't come with threats, they came with geological surveys. They whispered to the lords of the Blacklocks and the Stonefoots that the veins in Khazad-dûm were just the beginning. The real motherlode, they claimed, lay beneath their own mountains. They brought small samples of what looked like raw mithril, along with charts and advanced mining techniques that promised to extract it more efficiently than even the Longbeards could. The message was clear: you don't have to be junior partners forever. You can become the primary suppliers of the most valuable substance in Middle-earth. But there was a catch. The operation would require resources and coordination that only Sauron's advisors could provide. The Eastern Lords thought they were entering a business partnership. In reality, they were turning over the keys to their entire economy. Within a few decades, their prosperity became completely dependent on Sauron's operations. They had traded their independence for wealth, and they didn't realize it was a trap until it was too late. When the War of the Last Alliance came, they weren't fighting for a Dark Lord. They were fighting to protect their supply chain. The choice wasn't good versus evil, it was prosperity versus ruin. And perhaps the most insidious path to Sauron's service was not through greed or revenge, but through faith. Before he was the Dark Lord, Sauron was Myron, a Maya of the Vala Aule the Smith, the very being who created the dwarves. When Myron fell to shadow, he took with him not just the knowledge of smithcraft, but as some theories suggest, something far more sacred: fragments of the original creative fire Aule had used to awaken the first fathers of the dwarves. To a people whose entire identity revolved around their divine origin as master craftsmen, this is a world-shaking claim. Rumors began to spread from the east of a lord who could forge metals that sang and create gems that held starlight. His agents didn't come offering power, they came with a proof: a knife that could cut mithril, a chisel that revealed the hidden beauty in raw stone without a guide. And these weren't just superior tools, they were a theological statement. The implications were staggering. If Sauron truly held a piece of their creator's power, then maybe his rebellion wasn't a fall from grace, maybe it was a righteous act to reclaim the power that the other Valar sought to suppress. Maybe serving him wasn't betrayal, but a return to the true path of creation that Aule had always intended. The dwarf lords who fell for this were not motivated by greed, they were driven by the belief they were reclaiming their divine birthright. This wasn't corruption, it was evolution. They genuinely believed they were participating in the fulfillment of their people's ultimate destiny. When these dwarves marched to war, they did so under their own banners, convinced that they were fighting a holy war. Their forges, guided by this stolen fire, created terrible weapons, armor that filled its wearers with insatiable battle lust, and siege engines that didn't just break walls, but the spirits of those defending them. The tragedy was that in their desperate grasp for a divine connection, they allowed themselves to become instruments of pure destruction, trading their birthright as shapers of the world for a hollow promise of power over it. So how much of this is canon and how much is speculation? The foundation of this is solid, and Tolkien tells us quite plainly that evil dwarves existed. In The Hobbit, during the description of goblins, he notes in some parts wicked dwarves had even made alliances with them. More importantly, in the Silmarillion, during the account of the War of the Last Alliance, he makes a sweeping statement that all living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. Of the dwarves, few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. The line is explicit: dwarves fought on both sides. The phrase kindred of Durin specifically singles out the Longbeards as fighting with the good guys, which strongly implies that the ones fighting for Sauron were from the other clans. As we've seen, Tolkien's own notes point directly to the eastern clans as having fallen under the shadow long ago. The specific hows and whys, the economic warfare over mithril, the exploitation of the petty dwarves' grudge, the theological heresy, the stolen fire, are logical extensions of these canonical facts, built from the deep lore of dwarven culture, pride, and history that Tolkien wove throughout his works. They are compelling theories because they don't treat the dwarves as one-dimensional villains. Instead, they show how a proud, stubborn, and honorable people could, step by step, walk a path that led them right into the arms of the Dark Lord. Their fall wasn't a single event, but 1,000 different choices made for reasons that in the moment probably seemed perfectly logical. These hidden histories are what makes Tolkien's world feel so real. The stories that aren't told are often just as important as the ones that are, and as a reminder, if you enjoy these kinds of deep dives, you can join my free fantasy community on School and get 4 of my titles right away. The link is down below, and I will see you in the next video.